Hello Hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. Hunters, when angels first appeared in Supernatural, they were some of the most imposing creatures in the show. They were armed with a plethora of superpowers, including instant teleportation via spiritual wings. They could perceive way more than any human could ever hope to understand. And most importantly, they had very few weaknesses. It is established early on that mortals just didn't stand much of a chance against these holy warriors. Their strength and durability made fistfights almost completely useless, and if you could get a hold of one of the very few angelicidal weapons, you still had to overcome their speed and senses. Hell, even demons struggled against the God Squad, and this was back when low-level demons still posed at least a bit of a threat. For the first few seasons after their intro, angels kept this kind of presence in the series, more or less. They did become a bit easier to deal with once angel blades and holy fire become more common, but still, angels weren't complete fodder. Then, around season 9 or 10, things changed. Suddenly, angels just weren't the threat that they used to be. Almost all of them lost the ability to teleport thanks to Metatron's spell, and as I said a minute ago, their weaknesses became standard parts of the Hunter kit. Those factors certainly contributed to their decline, but it was more than that. In the later seasons, they also seemed to just be weaker in general. Suddenly, regular people could slap them around with relative ease, and at times, it also seemed like they just weren't as perceptive as they used to be. This nerf didn't go unnoticed, and it's left fans scratching their head, wondering what the hell happened. Why did these celestial soldiers slide so far down the power scale they reach putty territory? Is it all just lazy writing? Yes, but it's more fun to theorize about possible in-universe lore explanations. So let's look into that, shall we? Before we get into the cause of this nerfing, I feel like I should paint a clear picture of just how exactly angels were presented in early seasons versus late series, just in case there's people watching who don't believe that there's a difference. Here's what it's like to deal with angels in seasons 4 through 8. When Cass first shows up, he casually tanks multiple gunshots and the demon knife right to the heart without even flinching. Now, that kind of damage wouldn't actually do much to most monsters, but it would at least slow him down for a sec. When humans get in his way, all he has to do to neutralize them is poke him in the forehead, and they instantly fall asleep. It's a move that's so quick and cold, it really sells the idea that humans pose literally no threat, and they're not even worth actually fighting. This is further supported when we see Dean deck Cass in the face in the season 4 finale. Not only does Cass barely react, Dean acts like he just punched a brick wall. Now, Cass does get whooped by the bare hands of the demon Alistair, but that dude was a white-eyed demon, meaning he was one of the toughest devils in existence. In that same episode, we saw that Uriel effortlessly manhandled and destroyed 2 black-eyed demons, meaning that even common Hellspawn were outgunned by a relatively low-level angel. Basically, for their entire debut season, there's not a single mortal attack that can harm an angel. The only options hunters have for dealing with the heavenly host is to send them away with an angelic banishing sigil, but even that is just a temporary solution. Things change a bit once angel blades come into the picture. When first introduced in season 4, it wasn't super clear if humans could use these things to take out angels, but even after this was confirmed, it still didn't do much to make angels less deadly. Even if you get your hands on a divine poker, you still have to find a way to actually hit them, which is tough because they can teleport. Up through season 8, we only see a handful of angels slain by something besides another angel, and in most cases, they were taken out by surprise attacks. Even beyond the warping, angels were just really tough to deal with 1v1. They're incredibly strong, to the point that they can yeet people across the room one-handed. They're also presented as extremely talented close-quarters sword fighters, who use actual technique in their blade play rather than just hacking and slashing wildly. It's also worth mentioning that angels don't have to get up close and personal. If threatened with an angel blade, they can use things like telekinesis and blasts of heavenly light to snipe their opponent from a distance. And actually, those kinds of powers were more prominent around season 8. Speaking of powers, angels had a lot of them, making them incredibly potent creatures outside of combat. Things we see from the God Squad in early seasons include reviving the dead, time travel, invisibility, pyrokinesis, electrokinesis, the ability to heal, reconstruct, and rearrange the human body. Also, as I said earlier, their senses and perception operate on a completely different level from humans. On several occasions, we saw Cass perform a detailed chemical analysis by just looking at something. And later in the series, he specifically stated that angels don't really experience things like flavor. Instead, they interpret sensory information on a molecular level. Their insight goes well beyond the physical world. Angels can naturally see the true faces of spiritual beings like angels and demons inside of a vessel, and it seems like this is an involuntary skill since Cass retained his demon detector even while experiencing amnesia. So that's how angels were initially presented, and to be clear, they never became, like, the complete antithesis of that or anything. Across the whole series, we do see powerful angels who put the fear of heaven into their enemies, but there was a noticeable shift in the effectiveness of angels as a whole. Specifically, there were two scenes that really caught fans' attention and left them confused. Remember how I said that Dean once nearly broke his hand punching Cass in the face? Well, in the penultimate episode of Season 10, he's suddenly able to effortlessly trounce Cass and nearly end him without breaking much of a sweat. Now, to be fair, Dean was powered up by the Mark of Cain at the time, and Cass didn't really want to hurt his friend, but at the same time, he was also actively trying to detain Dean. So you can maybe chalk that one up to plot, but what's much harder to explain is the time that Cass was ambushed by a group of demons. In the Season 14 premiere, our boy goes to a bar to meet with a punk-ass demon, and when negotiations break down, the wannabe devil reveals that every other patron in the bar is also a demon. This wouldn't be a narrative problem if it were Sam or some other human getting jumped, but like I just said a minute ago, angels are supposed to have possession X-ray vision as their default setting. That had been established and reaffirmed multiple times. I mean, maybe these demons were using some sort of concealer spell, but there's no mention of anything like that in this episode or the show at all. We see these kinds of weaknesses most often in Cass, since he's a main character, but it's not just him. After Season 8, angels in general just start using their powers less, they couldn't take as much mundane damage, their fights became sloppier and less effective, and overall, they just didn't seem like much of a threat. Now, there was a very important event in the show that directly explains some of the decline. In the Season 8 finale, Metatron uses a spell to cast every single angel besides himself out of heaven and seal the pearly gates behind them. This expulsion had huge consequences for the species, because it wasn't just an eviction. The act of being cast out caused almost every angel in existence to have their wings badly burnt, to the point that they could no longer teleport. Eventually, Metatron sort of reopened heaven by establishing a portal to the realm on Earth. However, the rest of the damage was never repaired, meaning that from Season 9 to the end of the show, most angels have to rely on feet and wheels to get around just the same as mortals. Could this damage be the cause of all the angelic weakness we saw later in the show? Well, it's definitely a strong possibility. After all, when humans suffer massive horrific damage to a major limb, they can be left with a host of other problems that might not be immediately obvious. So it stands to reason that angels might be affected in a similar way. Hell, we actually see firsthand that damage and injuries can cause an angel to become weaker and less effective. I mean, that is usually how things work, but I'm just saying that we don't need to assume that an injured angel will be less angelic. We saw it firsthand. Perhaps the damage to their wings was enough to affect them across the board, either permanently or just until they can adjust to their new situation. Totally possible, but whether or not burnt wings are the primary cause of their overall downgrade, I definitely feel like there are a couple other factors that could be at play. Firstly, it's important to understand that, while heavenly wings grant angels the ability to teleport, they aren't the main source of their mystical powers. No, what actually fuels their miracles is their grace, a sort of divine energy or essence unique to angels and their bastard offspring, the Nephilim. Honestly, if you have to pick one thing that makes an angel, it wouldn't be their wings, it'd be grace. It's actually a major plot point that fully removing an angel's grace will cause them to lose 99.9% of their angelic powers and qualities, and effectively render them a human with all the usual pathetic human weaknesses. So, a full degracing is pretty severe. However, the heavenly hosts are also adversely affected by a partial loss of their grace. At several points in the show, we see that, while angels who only lose some of their grace don't become fully human, they do become more human. They're still angels, but they're more easily affected by earthly damage and limitations. Now, as long as they have even a speck of grace left in them, then it seems like the entirety of their juice will eventually regenerate. Well, unless they've been spiritually cut off from heaven, like Cass was in Season 5. In that case, his angelic mojo didn't refill as it usually would, and once it was fully depleted, he was rendered fully human, more or less. Point is, we know for a fact that the loss of grace will cause angels to become more human, so maybe this could explain the God Squad's gradual decline in effectiveness. Now, I know what you're saying. Jack, you irresistible faceless beefcake, When exactly would the angels as a whole have lost any grace? That didn't even happen during the expulsion. You're as foolish as you are dashing. Well, here's the thing. While we don't directly see angeldom get a mass gracectomy, there is actually an argument to be made that Metatron's spell did mess up their ability to recharge their batteries. A minute ago, I said that at one point Cass was prevented from refueling by being, quote, cut off from heaven. This statement doesn't ever really get explained in depth, but based on what we see, I've always interpreted this to mean that grace, or at least the energy that allows it to recharge, flows from heaven itself, and a proper connection to the homeland is needed for angels to fully drink it in. Admittedly, there's a bunch of weird cases of renegade halos retaining their powers and angelic nature centuries after running away from paradise, but considering what we saw in Season 5, I still think it makes sense that futzing with an angel's connection to heaven can affect their ability to properly replenish their Jehovah juice. But still, what does that have to do with the expulsion? Well, remember, the spell didn't just boot everyone downstairs. It also fundamentally altered how all of the angels interacted with their home dimension for the rest of the series. Obviously, they weren't fully and permanently cut off in the same way that Cass was, but it was still a massive change that limited their exposure to heavenly forces to a single fixed portal. As such, I think it would make sense for this event to negatively affect their ability to recharge their power gauge in the same way, meaning that even if most of the angels didn't actually lose any grace, they might not be able to regenerate what they use as quickly or completely. Couple that with the damage to their wings, and, well, you've got angels who've had both of their most angelic ingredients heavily worked with. So, it would make total sense for them to be a touch less divine. Actually, angelic grace and wings might just be a bit more closely linked than I give them credit. In the Ghostfacer's web episode, Meet Castiel, Cass himself claims that angelic wings are made of spiritual energy, and considering that grace itself is some form of spiritual energy, it makes me wonder, could angel wings just be made of grace? Or maybe they're a manifestation or extension of it? That's not the only bit of connective tissue. In the Season 12 episode, Rock Never Dies, we saw a heavily damaged Lucifer heal himself and power up by reabsorbing an old fossilized feather that apparently came off of his wings at some point in the past. This moment is interesting for a few reasons. Firstly, it's one of the only times when the show directly addresses angelic feathers. I mean, we see them whenever angels flex their wings, and one of the hallmarks of the expulsion is the fact that said wings now lack most or all of their feathers. But I think that this is the only time that the writers actually gave us a glimpse of their actual use. Secondly, the fact that Lucy can use one of his feathers to restore himself really makes it seem like these feathers are either filled with or made of grace. I can't prove it, but it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, when Lucifer juices up here, he gives off a bright glow that's visually similar to the one that follows Castiel's retaking of his grace in Season 10, so there's that. If nothing else, this connection would pretty much fully explain why the angels seem less potent after the fall. Not only were they heavily injured, they also just straight up permanently lost a chunk of their angel fuel. Okay, so those are both solid options. But unfortunately, there's one question that neither of them do a particularly good job of answering. How the hell did Cass walk into a demon ambush? Like, we can say that he was still injured and maybe didn't have as much grace as before, but considering the fact that even fallen angels with no grace at all retain some level of spiritual perception, I just don't think that those explanations cut it. So, what gives? Well, there's a few things that differentiate Cass from most of the host. Firstly, the poor bastard went through more changes in just a few years than most of his siblings would go through in their entire lives. Not only was he rendered effectively human twice within 4 years, he also was transformed into a godlike being, then possessed by Leviathans and later Lucifer. He had his brain scrambled and unscrambled, not to mention being killed and revived 4 separate times, and all that in addition to the expulsion. That's a lot. And I would totally buy that his circuits might have just gotten extra fried by all the manhandling. But I think there's something else that could have been going on. See, not only did Cass spend more time than most angels living on Earth as human, he also embraced those experiences more than most of his kin. By the end of his life, Cass seemed to enjoy many aspects of life on Earth. He made time to do things like watch TV, eat food even though he didn't need to, and read for fun. Not only that, There are several points in the series where he just outright admits that there are certain aspects of life that he prefers to experience via human senses rather than angelic ones. For example, taste and flavor. With that in mind, I definitely think it's possible that, on occasion, Cass might have intentionally dialed down his super senses in order to give himself a more human view of the world around him. Admittedly, there's not really a lot of strong evidence for that, and it would still be extremely weird for him to walk into a meeting with a demon with his spectral senses voluntarily nerfed. But I don't know, I just think it's a cute idea, Cass wanting to be more like his adopted brothers than his celestial family. Still doesn't excuse how stupid this plot hole was, though. But what do you guys think? Do any of these explanations help lessen the impact of the inconsistent writing? Let me know with a comment. I'll have more content for you soon, but for now, carry on,